2 Corinthians chapter 8, we're going to learn about godly giving and how Paul instructs the church in Corinth to do just that. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, he begins by saying he wants them to know the example of the Macedonians. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 1, Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. For to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministry to the saints. And this they did, not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord, and unto us by the will of God. Insomuch that we desired Titus, that as he had begun, so he would also finish in you the same grace also. Therefore, as you abound in everything, in faith, and utterance, and knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love to us, see that you abound in this grace also. I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. First, Paul gives a couple of illustrations on how to give, and the first one that he uses here is the example of the Macedonians. Well, we can know a little bit about who the Macedonians included. When Paul received this vision in Acts of a man over in Macedonia saying, come over and help us, they go over to Macedonia, and there was those in Thessalonica, there was those in Philippi, and there were those in Berea. And in each of those occasions, what happened was a conflict and a trial, because not everybody received the Word of God readily. There were these people who attacked Paul. There was people who even chased him down in the next city. And Paul was even put in prison in Philippi. And so, not everyone was noble-minded like the Bereans were. And so he's reminding the Corinthians of the giving nature of these people who are in these difficult circumstances. Now think about that. People who were following Christ and yet it cost them. They were poor. And he even brings this point out. When he says, I want you to know about them, we can look at other places and see examples of this. Like in the Philippian letter in chapter 4, Paul writes to that church in Philippi and says, there was a time when no one took part in this partnership of giving and receiving, but you only. You were the only ones. Now, Philippi would have been a church in Macedonia, so it would have been included in that. And now here he's saying, I want to tell you about their giving nature. They didn't give because they had an abundance of wealth. They didn't give because they were overflowing with so much. They gave because they had a heart to give. And there is a very good example, very much like the widow that Jesus referred to. And Jesus said that she gave more. Now the amount that she actually gave was not more. There were others who were probably given larger amounts, but she gave all she had. And he's telling us about these churches that gave not just what they had, but even beyond their ability, he says. Now I think that's a great example. I've known people in my life who are very much like that. I've known people that are very blessed materially, and they are very good givers. But then there are those who maybe don't have as much, but they're still willing to give. Very generous. And I think that's a great example to have. in verse 4, it's like you see this insisting nature that they want to take part. It's something they wanted to do. It's not something they felt guilt-tripped into do. Can you make somebody give? Well, it is a commandment to give. The amount is not commanded. But the attitude behind it, that of being a cheerful giver, is something that should be done of one's own heart because one wants to. And we see the attitude here that they want to give. I find it also interesting in verse 2 that even though these Macedonians who were such giving people, it says that they had this joy in giving. Isn't that interesting? You know, sometimes we say give till it hurts. But these people wanted to give and they were happy to give. They weren't giving and it doesn't give you the idea that they were cringing while they're giving, that they're saying, oh, this hurts so bad. But no, they wanted to give. And they had a joy behind that giving. Where does that come from? Well, I think it comes from, first off, from an understanding of what God does with us and what Jesus has done. I believe that's where the Macedonians learned it. And so he tells about that. Look at verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. I think Christ's example is the greatest example of giving that we could ever find, and we can never outgive him. Who told Jesus to give? Who commanded him to give? It wasn't a payment. It was a gift. We did not earn that. And we can never do enough to earn that. Jesus had everything, and he gave up everything in order for us to be wealthy. And now he's telling the Corinthians, use that as an example. Follow him. You take your abundance and you give willingly as Jesus did, out of joy, and follow that. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around how much Jesus gave, because he gave all of it. He came to this earth. He was mistreated. He was born not in a wealthy family. He was born in a poor family. We know that because his parents, whenever they went to make the sacrifice, and that would normally have been a lamb, but the old law gave a provision that if they could not afford that, they could give 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And the account tells us that's what they gave. So that tells us they were poor. Isn't it interesting that a family that could not afford much, that in the middle of some wanting to attack Jesus, not understanding his mission, that there were those who came from the east and then they gave these gifts that would have been provisions for Joseph and Mary to now be able to help them be able to escape and go to Egypt. They now had gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and had possibly now an ability to travel. God provides. And sometimes there are those who don't know where their money's coming from, but some way, somehow, God provides. I think of the widow that Elijah went to, and he provided for him and her. Out of all she had was like one little bit of oil in order to make one last meal before she died. And he asked her to make first for him, and then that supplied them for a while. The same God that took people in the wilderness and supplied manna when they didn't have anything and gave them water out of rocks. The same Christ who later fed multitudes when people were hungry. God knows how to provide. And God will know how to provide for us. And what we're taught to do, though, is whenever we're blessed, remember where that came from and then share that. Don't be stingy. And what is taking place here is in the first letter, we learn in chapter 16 of the first letter that he encourages them to take up a collection for these needy saints that were in Jerusalem. And so we know that they had a willingness to do this. And Paul is saying, I know you had a willingness, but I want you to fulfill that. I want you to not just have good intentions. I want you to now make sure you put this into action. And I think that's the way with us. Sometimes we want to do good. We know to do good. We have all plans to do good, and sometimes we don't follow through with those plans. But he's encouraging them to do that. Giving is referred to as a grace of God. Notice that in verse 1. I want you to know of the grace of God bestowed upon them. Think about that and attach that to giving. Grace means favor or a gift. It's something. It's not a payment. It's a gift. And I think it's good for us to think of giving as a form of grace. God gives us grace, and so we need to extend grace to others. Grace is something that needs to be shared. What does it say about us if we've been given so many things and then now we hoard and we don't want to now share that with others? Something that was actually given to us to begin with it. And so now we're sitting here being like, no, this is mine, when it really wasn't ours to begin with. So think of giving as a form of grace that you're sharing and partnering back in turn. He also refers to it as a form of fellowship. In verse 4, he uses that term, fellowship. He says, praying us with much entreaty that you would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship. Some of your translations may say taking part in the relief. Others may say in participation or sharing. That Greek word, koinonia, though, is the idea of fellowship. Some people think of fellowship as in eating together, physically. But biblical fellowship is actually the idea of a partnering or sharing in the work and what we do together. Now, think of it this way. When you give of your means to a brother or sister who is in need, you are having fellowship with them. You're partnering with them in the faith. You're sharing with them. Very much like those first century Christians in the book of Acts, who they would sell their possessions and they would lay it at the apostles' feet. There's examples of that. And it says they had all things common. That's the idea, they're sharing. And it says, no man thought of the things that he possessed as his own. Think about it that way. Like in your household, when you share, and you have, let's say you have food that's there, and I don't know what all goes on in your homes, and I'm not saying if somebody says, well, this is something they made and they set aside for that or whatever, but what would you think, though, if every item was all labeled out like that and there wasn't a sense of sharing? There was something wrong with that picture. But there's the idea of, hey, what's mine is yours. Help yourself. We share. And I'm happy to be able to do that. And that needs to come from a willingness, not browbeated. In Exodus 35, we see this attitude. Whenever the tabernacle was erected, there were those who were asked to give to it. They had to get the means somehow. There were items that were needed, whether it was for the fabric, for the tent, whether it was for the weaving of that curtain or the veil that separated the holy from the most holy. Some people needed to contribute with their talent and their ability. Other people needed to contribute with their gold, with their silver, with whatever items they had. And they asked. And what was said was, whoever is of a willing heart. I like that. Whoever wants to. It's not that you have to, but whoever wants to. And then in chapter 36 of Exodus, in verse 7, he had to tell everybody, hey, stop. We already have too much. A good example of when they gave too much. They gave to the need, and then once the need was fulfilled, now they have too much. Okay, thank you. We've got all that we need. It's too much now. And they gave to their ability. In verse 3 here of chapter 8, notice it says, for to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power. So they gave above their ability. But then later, when Paul mentions this, he says, I don't want you to see that this, God is not asking for something you can't do. He's asking for what you can do. So we see that example. But whenever in verse 7 he says, take the example of the Macedonians, take the example of Jesus, how that the Macedonians gave whenever they were poor, Jesus gave whenever he was rich. Two examples of giving. One group who gave when they didn't really have it. One gave when he had it all. But still great examples of giving. But then in verse 7 he says, you're abounding in so many things. I want you to now excel and abound in this. Therefore, as you abound in everything, in faith, in utterance, in knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love to us, see that you abound in this grace also. You've done so well, Paul is saying, in these other areas. So I know you have it in you. And he's encouraging them to apply that here. Now, if you would, notice in verse 11. Now, therefore, perform the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to will, so there may be a performance also of that which you have. For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. Paul is not asking the impossible. He's not asking... Now, he gave the example of the Macedonians who gave above their ability, but he's not trying to squeeze every dime and hurt them. He's not trying to get them to burden themselves, but he's wanting them to give. Now, so first what we've got to do is we've got to take an example here. I think the same thing, whatever he's teaching them, how we apply this to us today. There are some among us who can have the ability more than others. And this is not like a set fee where everybody gives the exact same amount. And it's not a competition. It's not a competition to see who can give the most and get the credit for it. It's simply from a willing heart. And aren't you glad that God doesn't judge us based upon what somebody else can do, but He judges us based upon what we as individuals can do? I think that's that way in a lot of things. That God doesn't expect me to do what I can't do. He only expects me to do what I'm able to do. Yet I do believe that I need to have an attitude, and you need to have an attitude of stretching ourselves and thinking about, whenever we work, to not always think about what I can get out of others. Not always be thinking of what others can do for me. But work in order to be able to share. I can think of occasions where, so many times, where brethren have given to me whenever I wasn't even asking for it. And I think about all those times. If I were to add up all of those times in dollar amounts, I don't think I can possibly give back what has been given to me. I especially can't give back to God what He's given to me in forgiving me of my sins and giving me a hope of heaven, and giving me brethren as friends to encourage me and build me up. Brethren who have supported me in the gospel. Brethren, even whenever I wasn't preaching full time, who have shared and given to me, had me in their homes, put me up and who have put up with me. Just all kinds of things that I have to be thankful for. And so there has to be a sense of duty to want to try to return the favor somehow. To want to take those examples and then do the same. Pay it forward. And I think that's what Paul is talking about here. This attitude of wanting to learn from the examples of others giving and do the same. I think there's a point in which we need to say, there might be some among us who might say, you know what, I'm the one in need. And I might need others to help me. And maybe that's the case. But hopefully the time will come for you to see that you don't want it to be this way forever. So that you can take this, use it to the best of your ability, get back on your feet, be a wise steward, live below your means, and be wise so that you can now have a little extra that you can give. I think that's a wise attitude that we all need to strive to work towards. To not always be the kind of person that just walks with her hand out, to think the church owes me all the time, but to think, what can I do to help others? This is where it is more blessed to give than to receive. But also, I think there's a point where maybe we have been giving, but it might come a time where we might need that back ourselves. And there could be a sense of pride and unwillingness that I'm not going to ever take a dime off of anybody. While there's a balance in this, recognize that. On one hand, we don't want to be a beggar. We don't want to always be the one receiving. Yet there might come a time where we might be that person. And in that case, it's a time where, let's say it's a legit case of someone being in need. Then we should be willing to let someone else give in return and receive it. That there's two sides to this. And it should be enjoyed among both parties. That's a part of this grace. There's a receiving of grace, and then there's a giving of grace. And we might be on either end of that at times in our life. And while it ought to be our aim in order to be the one giving, there may also be the time in order to be able to receive it as well. And there's no shame in receiving it if you haven't done anything wrong and it's just circumstances. It's not a laziness or a lack of or willingness to work or poor money management or something like that. It just circumstances that has led to that. It's not sinful to be in need in and of itself. And it actually is not always even an unwise thing to be in need. Even though we should try and aim to practice principles that God gives us in the book of Proverbs and elsewhere throughout the Bible about how to manage what we do have. Jesus came, and Jesus was poor. And there were times even where he said he didn't even have a place to lay his head. And there was a times where he said birds of the air have nests, but I don't even have a place to lay my head. There were others who said, I'll go with you wherever you go. And Jesus questioned them, are you sure? And then there were other times where he told his disciples to only take what you need. And then on other occasions, take a little extra. So there are differing circumstances and differing times and needs. So recognize that whenever we take this into account and try to apply it. But notice that in verse 13, he says, For I mean not that other men be eased and ye burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, and their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. There he's now talking about what I was referring to. That maybe the time might come, if you give to them now, maybe the time might come where they can return the favor. And then verse 15, As it is written, He that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. Now here what he's referring to is he's going back to the time of manna in Exodus. In that narrative of what took place in the wilderness in Exodus 16, he told them to go out one day at a time, get enough manna for the day. Don't store up more, because if you do, it'll breed worms and stink. Don't hoard it. He was teaching them to take one day at a time. Well, those who went out and gathered up to try to, to excessively do that, then guess what happened? It bred worms and stank. But here's what's interesting. Different people have different needs and appetites. Well, some need more than others. Some families are larger than others. Some families are smaller. And those who needed more, guess what? They were full. They had everything they needed. And those that did not need as much, well, it wasn't that they were starving and doing without. And so here's the idea, that there was enough for everybody. And that's what God supplied. And he's using this an example of what God did for them and what they had, and saying, okay, well, let's be willing to share that among our brethren. Now, verse 16, but thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care into the heart of Titus for you. Now he's using another example of individuals, Titus being one of them. Look at his giving nature. What did he do? Verse 17, for indeed he accepted the exhortation, but being more forward of his own accord, he went into you. Again, it's not something that he was browbeated or had to be begged to do. It's something he was willing to do. But verse 18, we have sent with him the brother, whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. So Titus is not the only one. There's another individual here that he's mentioned that goes along with him. And then verse 19, and not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace, which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord and declaration of your ready mind. And so some have said that maybe perhaps there's even another one being referred to here that's unnamed. But either way, whether there's two or whether there's three, Titus being one and one or two unnamed, you see their willingness to volunteer and help out. If you think about it, what we're doing this morning, and those who have taken part, is of a volunteer nature. Somebody had to have a heart and a willingness to say, you know what, I want to be used. I want to be involved. A lot of intricate parts of trying to make sure that we could meet together today. And sometimes there are those who do it and they're often unnamed. And they're not doing it for the credit. They're doing it because they want to give to God in different ways, different abilities. A volunteer is a beautiful picture. Tennessee is referred to as the volunteer state. I like that. I think of the idea of an army of people, spiritually speaking, who have enlisted themselves, who said, I want to be counted, I want to be involved, I want to be able to give and serve. And that's what I see the church as. An army of not drafted soldiers, not those who are coerced and forced and made, but those who have decided, I want to enlist in God's army and I want to be involved. And I see the family as one of more like perhaps what we would view as a meal where we all contribute. There is a big difference in going to a restaurant, paying someone to cook it, paying and tipping a waiter or a waitress who serves you, and then somebody else cleans up, and then you get to leave. Not that that's necessarily bad or wrong in of itself, but there's something a lot more beautiful in the picture of many people contributing. Somebody buys food, somebody prepares it, somebody serves it, and somebody pays for it somebody helps clean up. When you're all involved in helping in that, there's a great beauty in sharing in that family meal where it's all joined in together. And it seems like when more people are involved, there's more of an appreciation and a thankfulness for what you have. The one who prepares it, if there's only one that does it, it seems like that one knows, but sometimes the others take it for granted, what all's involved. But I think that's the beauty of giving and sharing among ourselves. When Titus and the other brothers go to them, it says in verse 19, and not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace. Again, he calls it a grace again. And he says, which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord and declaration of your ready mind. Again, they're not doing what they're doing. They're not serving in order to get praise of men. They're doing it to glorify God. And that's an important thing. Sometimes there are people who want to give and they want the whole world to know how much they're giving. Because there is a what's in it for me. Maybe it's I want the praise and the glory for it. But here we see that he says it's to the glory of the same Lord. It's multiple people working together in order to glorify God. And they're doing it without coercion and of a ready mind. Verse 20, avoiding this that no man should blame us in this abundance which is administered by us, providing for honest things not only in the sight of the Lord but also in the sight of men. Now here what I think he's talking about is integrity and an openness, a willingness to show the accounting and show that, they're going to be handling some money and they don't want people thinking that they're taking any of it or robbing any of it. And so what does Paul do? He has other men accompanying him, other witnesses who can vouch for that. We understand this principle in some things. Sometimes it's in business. Some churches do this where whenever the money's counted, multiple people count it. So there's an accounting. Some people have like multiple people signing a check in order to have... so everything is above board. There's no question whether somebody is pocketing a little. And sometimes that can happen. Judas is a case in point. Sometimes people want to put their own fingers in it. But Paul is not looking to ask them to give in order for him to get a little for himself. Paul is asking them to give because it's a godly thing to do. And he's being honest and above board about it. And then verse 22. And we have sent with him our brother, whom we have oftentimes proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent upon the great confidence which I have in you. Now, isn't this interesting how Paul talks sometimes? It's like he expects them to give. It's like, I have confidence in you that you're going to do this. I believe you will. I think we need to have more of this attitude among our brethren. Some people are always negative about their views of brethren, thinking the worst. And I don't think that's a good attitude. I think we need to give our brethren the benefit of the doubt. We need to assume the best in our brethren. We need to expect the best in our brethren and believe that they will do the right thing and they will give whenever they're called upon, as they're able. And so in verse 23, whether any do inquire of Titus, he is my partner and fellow helper concerning you, or our brethren be inquired of, they are the messengers of the churches and the glory of Christ. Wherefore show ye to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. Now here what he's saying is, don't think of these others as my underlings and my servants. I don't think Paul treated Titus and the other brothers as if they were beneath him. He calls them my fellow helpers or my partners. And I think that's the way we need to see each other. Regardless of the workload of each. We're all equals. We're all brothers. We're all partners. And whatever our role is and how we work, that's the way we need to see it. No hierarchy. There's no clergy and no laity. There's no big person and then a little person. Simply teammates working together for a common cause. And then he's asking them, you know, I've told people that you're going to do this, that I believe that you will give what you're able. And now he's asking them to show proof. And I think that there's an advantage in having these mentalities of expecting these kinds of things from each other. Again, when we think about this, just think about God's abundant giving nature. And people can say they love you. People can claim it. But where's the real proof? The proof is what they do. And when we give, Jesus remembered that he said that if inasmuch as you do this to the least of these my brothers, you've done it to me. When we're giving to each other, we're giving to God. And I believe the Lord takes that personally whenever you share in those ways. And so let's be that kind of a people as we are. And let's continue to grow and further that. Appreciate your attention. When I think about God's gift to us and giving us the avenue of forgiveness, why not receive that grace of God? With all readiness, ready to say, you know, I love and I'm thankful that Jesus gave everything for me. And I'm willing to commit my life back in return to Him. Because I want to give what little I can. And I want to give my time, I want to give my heart, I want to give my commitment to Him. By changing my ways to follow Him, by confessing that I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, by being baptized, and having all my sins washed away, and I have hope, and now I have all the reason to continue to serve Him and give what I can. If you're a Christian, hopefully you have all the motivation that you should ever need in order to want to give what you can. You have that example that they first gave their own selves to the Lord and then to others. That's what we're asking. That's what God is asking of you. First give yourself to Him. And then it's very easy after that to give what you need in order to give and share to others. Whatever your need is, if you need to make correction, you want to obey the Lord, you want to put Him on in baptism, won't you do that while we stand and as we sing?